Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Talking Behaviour, where I am Charlie, and with me is,
James, hello.
and we will be your host for today. And we will be starting a new free episode series on language and communication, where we will be starting with the titled episode. And we will potentially be moving on to how to teach first language and then communication at a later date. We have previously talked about on the show sensory processing and self-stimulatory behavior, and hopefully this should be moving on to another kind of parent-focused area where people might, notice an issue they're particularly experiencing and potentially see some solutions that you might think of in those circumstances. How are you, James?
Yeah, all good, thank you. Yourself?
Yeah, I'm doing pretty good, thank you. So we're starting with language and communication. What do you think about that? Do you know much about that kind of
What about?
area yourself?
Not masses, obviously. I mean, I know that what the words mean and what they result in, but I don't know too much about the science behind it, and I have absolutely no idea about how you would begin to implement that into somebody who doesn't already have those skills.
Yeah, so I mean, like everybody will have a certain amount of language and a certain amount of communication as a base level, unless you are extremely impaired. There will always be some sort of system which is functioning to allow you to understand what is going on around you, or understand the structure of what other people are trying to communicate to you, and then how interactions between you and other people are kind of managed. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So language is the kind of big thing in this that goes down into communication. It's like the over category rather than the kind of subcategory, if you get me. Um, Language is best understood as how complexly we can understand the world around us and put it into the words that we need to in the language that we were trained in. It's bad practice to use the word itself in the definition, I suppose. But what I'm saying is, you were born in England, right? You speak English. This is the language which you were raised to speak. Because of this, you were taught from a child to be able to understand what the world around you was in this language.
Yeah.
Yes? So then what this does is you are taught successively complicated concepts when you're growing up, and these things synthesize into an understanding of the world around you. Right? Your language allows you to understand the world around you, and your understanding of the world around you is almost limited by your language. Right?
Yeah.
This is important when you're coming and talking about learning disabilities or people who might need additional support, because if you do not develop language quite early, it can actually stunt the development of your brain, right? You have a period of time when you're between the ages of about 0 to 4 where you have the most plasticity to your brain, right? This is where you learn the most, this is where you have the most input, and this is where you develop the most language, right? Once you're past 4, you can talk to other people and it's easier for you to understand what they're trying to communicate to you. You understand?
Yeah.
You'll note that language has a component of it, which is the communication between two individuals, but also an internal component to it, the classification of things around you and the understanding about how those things interact, right?
Yeah.
So language is really important, and oral tradition is like the way that we originally passed down all of the information that we had before we were able to put language into writing, which is one of the first technologies that we develop. It allows us to do this kind of cascade as a species that gets us to this point. Okay, when you're able to write, you're able to put down things in a concrete manner that cannot be changed without having to be physically altered. And once you're able to do that on a mass scale with printing, you get the ability to distribute information on a exponential curve, right? This is the development of the human species, but language is really tied into that, because you would, if you went back hundreds of thousands of years, have very different language structure as well as very different language function, because the concepts that those people had encountered and the things that they had been able to discern would be much simpler.
Even hundreds of years, I'd say.
Yeah. You can see this when you read like directly texts which have not been kind of like translated into modern parlance, I guess. But language is a really important thing, right? Because language allows us to understand even things which are quite ephemeral, like our emotions, right? Have you ever heard that there are cultures which have emotions or words for emotions that we don't?
I have heard that, but I could not put a specific on it.
I'll use a very common example is Germans have something called Schadenfreude. right? You will have probably heard of this now because Schadenfreude has become almost famous for the fact that it used to be something that people didn't really understand. It was a purely German thing, right? But now most people understand a slight kind of perverse pleasure from another person's misfortune.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this means that with the dissemination of that word into other languages, the concept of Schadenfreude has disseminated into the people who use it. Okay?
Yeah.
So this is language, and language allows us to communicate, which is a component of this kind of like whole model. And communication is a form of interaction where two people or more than one individual attempts to disseminate information to another, and one interprets that person.
Yeah.
Right? So that is language, and that is communication. Do you have any questions?
Would you say that language necessarily? I'd almost put them on a par, communication and language together.
Mhm.
Or are you saying that, in your opinion, language is entirely oral? Because you've got stuff like, for example, British Sign Language, which is non-oral, but does that
Yes.
count as a language?
It does count as a language, but it is not the same type of language as like English or French or German, because it's structured, British Sign Language, as English. Right, it is a translation or a kind of dialect of English, effectively, which is translated into a non-vocal format. There is a distinction between vocal and verbal.
Of course.
Okay, vocal being anything that comes from your vocal cords, allows you to talk, to copy, to echo, right? And then there is verbal, which is anything which allows you to communicate, right? Verbal Behaviour is a very famous book in the behaviour analytic world because it's written by B.F. Skinner, who is kind of the ultimate father of our science, right? There were people before him who did like, Pavlov, Watson, who did respondent conditioning, right? But then Skinner discovered operant conditioning and got this unified understanding of behaviour, which allows us to understand the behaviour of organisms, another one of his books, right?
Okay.
So very, very impressive person, Skinner, and there are a lot of studies which still directly are very translatable. He ran something which was the experimental analysis of behaviour, which is kind of this more purely scientific branch of the science that was looking into pigeon studies, rat studies back in the 60s. Very interesting if you look into it, and it's also a lot of gambling has taken that research and unfortunately turned it into things like slot machines, which, not all things go to good,
Yeah, no, of course.
So communication is very, very important because it's about how we pass information to each other, but it also breaks down a lot. But I guess we'll go into that when we go on to the communication episode. Since that's number 3, I'm not going to try and jump ahead of that. Any other questions about the general categories, I guess?
No, I think so. I think you've explained it quite nicely.
Okay, very, very good. Anything that is kind of like interesting out of that? Like, I'm thinking, do you have any questions that might... Nah, it's all good. We'll talk about that. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.